Good morning, guys. So today we are going to be finishing Farewell to Manzanar. We have one chapter left. It's chapter 22 called 10,000 Voices. So we have pages 185 to 203, but we are just going to be reading the one chapter. So 10,000 Voices starts out. As I came to understand what Manzanar had meant, it gradually filled me with shame for being a person guilty of something enormous enough to deserve that kind of treatment. In order to please my accusers, I tried, for the first few years after our release, to become someone acceptable. I both succeeded and failed. By the age of 17, I knew that making it, in the terms I had tried to adopt, was not only unlikely, but false and empty, no more authentic for me than trying to emulate my great-aunt Toyo. I needed some grounding of my own, such as Woody had found when he went to commune with her and with our ancestors in Kaki. It took me another 20 years to accumulate the confidence to deal with what the equivalent experience would have to be for me. It's outside the scope of this book to recount all that happened in the interim. So she's saying all that happened in between. Suffice to say, I was the first member of our family to finish college and the first to marry out of my race. As my husband and I began to raise our family, and as I sought for ways to live agreeably in my Anglo-American society, which basically just means like white American society, my memories of Manzanar for many years lived far below the surface. When we finally started to talk about making a trip to visit the ruins of the camp, something would inevitably get in the way of our plans. So something always got in the way. Mainly my own doubts, my fears. I have suspected that the place did not exist. So few people I met in those years had even heard of it, and those who had knew so little about it. Sometimes I imagine I had made the whole thing up, dreamed it. Even among my brothers and sisters, we seldom discussed the internment. If we spoke of it at all, we joked. When I think of how that secret lived in all our lives, I remember the way Kayo and I responded to a little incident soon after we got out of camp. We were sitting on a bus stop bench in Long Beach when an old embittered woman stopped and said, "Why don't all you dirty Japs go back to Japan?" She spit at us and passed on. We said nothing at the time. After she stalked off down the sidewalk, we did not look at each other. We sat there for maybe 15 minutes with downcast eyes and finally got up and walked home. We couldn't bear to mention it to anyone in the family. And over the years, we never spoke of this insult. It stayed alive in our separate memories, but it was too painful to call out into the open. In 1966, I met a Caucasian woman who had worked for 1 year as a photographer at Manzanar. I could scarcely speak to her. I desperately wanted to, but all my questions stuck in my throat. This time, it was not the pain of memory. It was simply her validation that all those things had taken place. Someone outside the close community of Japanese Americans had actually seen the camp, with its multitude of people and its swarm of buildings on the plain between the mountains. Something inside me opened then. I began to talk about it more and more. It was April 1972, 30 years almost to the day, that we piled our 3 kids into the car and headed out there. From where we live now in the California coast town of Santa Cruz, it's a full day's drive. We started down 101 to Paso Robles, crossed over the hammocky Diablo Range to the Central Valley, skirted Bakersfield, and climbed through Tehachapi Pass. I probably didn't say that right, so I'm sorry. At Mojave, we turned north onto the same road our bus had taken out from Los Angeles in April 1942. It is the back road to the Sierras and the main route from Southern California to Reno and Lake Tahoe. We joined bikers and backpackers and the skiers heading for Mammoth. The traffic through there is fast, everyone but the bikers making it for the high country. As we sped along wide roads at 60 and 70 with our kids exclaiming at the sights we passed and our car loaded down with camping gear, it seemed even more incredible to me that a place like Manzanar could have been anywhere within reach of such a highway, such a caravan of pleasure-seeking travelers. The bikers peeled off at Red Rock Canyon, a gorgeous bulge of pink cliffs and rusty gulches humping out of the flatlands. After that, it was lovely desert, but nothing much to stop for. In 100 miles, we passed 2 oases, the first at Olencha, the second around Lone Pine, a small tree-filled town where a lot of mountain buffs turned off for the Mount Whitney portal. A few miles out of Lone Pine, we started looking for another stand of trees, some tall elms, and what remains of those gnarled pear orchards. They were easy to spot. Everything else is sagebrush, tumbleweeds, and wind. At its peak in the summer of 42, Manzanar was the biggest city between Reno and Los Angeles, a special kind of western boom town that sprang from the sand, flourished, had its day, and now has all but disappeared. The barracks are gone, torn down right after the war. The guard towers are gone, and the mess halls and shower rooms, the hospital, the tea gardens, and the white buildings outside the compound. Even the dust is gone. Spreading brush holds it to the ground. 30 years earlier, Army bulldozers had scraped everything clean to start construction. What you see from the road are the 2 gatehouses, each a small empty pillbox of a building faced with flagstones and topped like tiny pagodas with shingled curving roofs. Farther in you see the elms, most of which were planted by internees, and off to the right a large green building that was once our high school auditorium, now a maintenance department for the Los Angeles Power and Water District, who leased the land to the government during the war and still owns it. Past the gatehouses, we turned left over a cattle guard and onto a dirt perimeter road that led to the far side of the campsite. About half a mile in, we spotted a white obelisk gleaming in the distance and marking a subtle line where the plain begins gradually to slope upward into the alluvial fan that becomes the base of the mountains. So they're just talking about different types of landscape, basically, there. It seemed miraculous, as if some block of stone had fallen from the peaks above and landed upright in the brush, chiseled, solitary, 12 feet high. Near it, a dozen graves were outlined in the sand with small stones, and a barbed wire fence surrounded them to keep back the cattle and the tumbleweed. The black Japanese script cut into the white face of the obelisk read simply, "A memorial to the dead." We were alone out there, too far from the road to hear anything but wind. I thought of Mama, now 7 years gone. For a long time, I stood gazing at the monument. I couldn't step inside the fence. I believe in ghosts and spirits. I knew I was in the presence of those who had died at Manzanar. I also felt the spiritual presence that always lingers near awesome wonders like Mount Whitney. Then, as if rising from the ground around us on the valley floor, I began to hear the first whispers, nearly inaudible from all those thousands who once had lived out here, a wide, windy sound of the ghost of that life. As we began to walk, it grew to a murmur, a thin, steady hum. We turned the kids loose, watched them scamper off ahead of us, and we followed what used to be an asphalt road running from the back side of the camp a mile out to the highway. The obelisk, built in 1943, and the gatehouses are all that have survived intact from internment days. The rest of the place looks devastated by a bombing raid. The old road was disintegrating, split, weed-sprung. We poked through the remains of hospital foundations, undermined by erosion channels. We found concrete slabs where the latrines and shower rooms stood, and irrigation ditches, and here and there the small rock arrangements that once decorated many of the entranceways. I had found out that even in North Dakota, when Papa and the other Issei men imprisoned there had free time, they would gather small stones from the plain and spend hours sorting through a dry stream bed looking for the veined or polished rock that somehow pleased the most. It is so characteristically Japanese, the way lives were made more tolerable by gathering loose desert stones and forming with them something enduringly human. So she's basically saying taking something from nature and making it human, giving it life, making it kind of like an art form with their rock gardens was something that was part of their culture. These rock gardens had outlived the barracks and the towers and would surely outlive the asphalt road and rusted pipes and shattered slabs of concrete. Each stone was a mouth speaking for a family, for some man who had beautified his doorstep. Vegetation gets thickest towards the center of the site, where the judo pavilion once stood and where rows of elms planted as windbreaks have tripled their growth since the 40s. In there we came across the remains of a small park. A stone-lined path ran along the base of a broad mound of dirt about 5 feet high. Stones had been arranged on the mound, and some low trees still shaded it and made an arch above the path. For a moment I was strolling again, finding childish comfort in its incongruous design. But after 10 feet the path ended in tumbleweeds. The trees were dry and stubbly, the mound was barren, and my attention was arrested by the water faucet sticking 2 feet out of the sand like some subterranean periscope. One of these had provided water for each of the barracks. They stuck up at intervals in every direction, strangely sharpening the loneliness and desolation, sometimes the only sign of human presence in an acre or two of sand. My mood had shifted. The murmur turned to wind. For a while I could almost detach myself from the place and its history and take pleasure in it purely as an archaeological site. I saw the outlines, patterns this city must have taken. I imagined where the building stood, almost as I once did nosing around old Roman villas in Europe. We saw a low ring of stones built up with cement and wondered who the mason was and who knelt there, and studied the shapes before fitting them together. We moved around the ring a few feet to find out. This was the old flagpole circle, where the stars and stripes were hoisted every morning, and the inscription scratched across the top said, "Built by Wada and crew, June 10th, 1942 A.D." The A.D. made me shiver. I knew that the man who inscribed it had foreseen these ruins and did not want his masonry identified with the wrong era. His words coming out of the stone became a voice that merged with all the others. Not a murmur this time, but low voices, muttering and chattering all around me. So she's kind of hearing voices in a way, just because of the memories that she's having. It's not because she's like crazy or anything, but she is thinking back about these things, and the wind, it's kind of everything sounds like those voices that she used to hear there. We were crossing what used to be a fire break, now a sandy field devoid of any growth. The wind was vicious there, with nothing to break it, and the voices grew. The fire break was where we had talent shows and dances and outdoor movies in the summer, and where the kids played games. I heard the girls' glee club I used to sing in, way off from the other side of camp, in their tiny grade school soprano singing, "Beautiful Dreamer, Wake Unto Me." I closed my eyes and I was 10 years old again. Nothing had changed. I heard laughter. It was almost dusk. The wind had dropped, and I saw old men squatting in the dirt, Papa and some of his cronies, which means friends, muttering and smoking their cigarettes. In the summertime, they used to burn orange peels under gallon cans with holes punched in the sides to keep the mosquitoes away. Sometimes they would bring out their boards to play Go and Hana. The orange peels would smolder in there, and the men would hunker down around the cans and watch smoke seep out of the holes. From that fire break, we cut across towards the first row of pear trees, looking for what might remain of Block 28. There wasn't much to guide us but the trees themselves and a view I remembered of the blunt, bulky Inyo Range that bounds the eastern limit of the valley. When we were close enough to smell the trees, we stopped. They were stunted, tenacious, tough, the way a cactus has to be. The water table in that one area has kept them living through all these years of neglect, and they were ready to bloom at any moment. The heady smell was as odd in that desert setting as the little scrap of park had been, as odd yet just as familiar. We used to picnic there in blossom time on weekends, if we got a wind-free day. The wind blew it towards us now, chilled pear nectar, and it blew our kids around a high stand of brush. They came tumbling across the sand, demanding to know what we were going to do out here. Our twins were 5 years old at the time, a boy and a girl. Our older daughter had just turned 11. She knew about the evacuation, but it would be a few more years before she absorbed this part of the family history. For these three, the site had been like any wreck or ruin. They became explorers, rushed around, hoping the next clump of dusty trees or chunk of wall might reveal the treasure, the trinket, the exotically rusted hinge. Nothing much had turned up. The shine was wearing off the trip. Their eyes were red and their faces badly chapped. No place for kids. My husband started walking them back to the car. I stayed behind a moment longer, first watching our 11-year-old stride ahead, leading her brother and sister. She has long dark hair like mine and was then the same age I had been when the camp closed. It was so simple, watching her, to see why everything that had happened to me since we left camp referred back to it in one way or another. At that age, your body is changing. Your imagination is galloping. Your mind is in that zone between a child's vision and an adult's. Papa's life ended at Manzanar, though he lived for 12 more years after getting out. Until this trip, I had not been able to admit that my own life really began there. The times I thought I had dreamed it were one way of getting rid of it, part of wanting to lose it, part of what you might call a whole Manzanar mentality I had lived with for 25 years. Much more than a remembered place, it had become a state of mind. Now, having seen it, I no longer wanted to lose it or to have those years erased. Having found it, I could say what you can only say when you've truly come to know a place. Farewell. I had nearly outgrown the shame and the guilt and the sense of unworthiness. This visit, this pilgrimage, made comprehensible, finally, the traces that remained and would always remain like a needle. That hollow ache I carried during the early months of internment had shrunk, over the years, to a tiny sliver of suspicion about the very person I was. It had grown so small sometimes I'd forget it was there. Months might pass before something would remind me. When I first read in the summer of 1972 about the pressure Japan's economy was putting on American business and how a union in New York City had printed up posters of an American flag with Made in Japan written across it, then that needle began to jab. I heard Mama's soft, weary voice from 1945 say, "It's all starting over." I knew it wouldn't. Yet neither would I have been surprised to find the FBI at my door again. I would resist it much more than my parents did, but deep within me something had been prepared for that. Manzanar would always live in my nervous system, a needle with Mama's voice. A gust of wind rushed through the orchard, bringing ice off the white slopes and more blossom scent. It hurt to inhale deeply. I pulled my coat tight, ready to head for the car's warmth, but also wanting to hold this moment a little longer. I might never be back here again. I was poking around brush clumps and foundation chunks, looking for something else. One more sign, anything. I found another collection of stones off by themselves, but so arranged that they could not have been accidental. Nearby, an edge showed through the sand. I uncovered a single stepping stone. stone, slightly worn, that led nowhere, yet lay as a subtle appendage to a small rock garden. One of these had lain outside our barracks door, a first step below 3 wooden ones. It could be ours. Perhaps not. Many barracks had such entrances, but this one would serve. I could call it the rock garden Papa put there. Almost the sign I wanted. Not quite. Not quite enough. There was more to all this than the lovely patience of these gathered stones. They were part of it, but there was something else in the air. A sound, a smell. Just a whiff hanging on that gust from the orchard, or blown down the ghostly alleyway of what used to be the street we lived on. I was hearing Mama's voice once more, but differently, louder now, right in front of me, and I smelled cork burning. That was one of Papa's remedies when her back knotted up. He would take little coins of cork and place them on the tension nodes and light them, and the cork would burn dark rings into her skin as she hunched on the porch steps groaning with relief. They were sitting on the steps like that, Mama hunched, Papa tending to the blackening rings, one morning a few days before we left camp. Now that smell and those voices in the wind from the orchard brought with them the sign I was waiting for, the image of a rekindled wildness in Papa's eyes. 27 years earlier, I had carried it with me out of camp, only half understanding what it meant. Remembering now, I realized I had never forgotten his final outburst of defiance. But for the first time, I saw it clearly as the gathered desert stones, and when I left today for good, I would carry that image with me again as the rest of my inheritance. It was the day Papa suddenly came back to life and decided to go into Lone Pine and buy a car. Mama had been packing, and that brought the uncertainty of our future to such a sharp point her back went into spasms. She didn't want to talk. She wanted to concentrate on the rings of heat. She let Papa rant a long time before she reacted. "That's crazy, Co," she said. "Don't call me crazy. You think I'm going to ride that stinking bus all the way to Los Angeles? It's cheaper than buying a car." "Cheaper? What is it worth to be packed in there like cattle? You call that cheap? We don't have money to buy a car." "I know how much money we have." He jumped to his feet then, rushed into the house, came out with his hat on and a shirt half buttoned, and his walking stick and his turtleneck sweater tied around his neck, and took off striding toward the main gate, leaving Mama with her back full of smoking cork, which had done no good at all since this new move of his merely bunched her muscles up worse than ever. It was late afternoon when we heard the horn, still blocks away. Without looking out the door, Mama said, "Here he comes." As the honks came closer, we heard another sound, like a boxer working out a flabby punching bag. Mama moved to the doorway. We all did. Shizu, May, me, in time to see a blue Nash four-door come around the corner, with its 2 front tires flat and Papa sitting up straight and proud behind the wheel, his hat cocked, his free hand punching at the horn. Heads were appearing at doorways all up and down the street. He stopped in front, racing the engine and grinning, while he eyed Mama and fingered the shiny knob dashboard gear shift. On the seat between his legs, he held a half-empty quart bottle of whiskey. He yelled, "What do you think, little Mama?" She didn't answer. He had not been drinking much at all for about 6 months. She stood there waiting to see what he was going to do. He laughed and made the engine roar and demanded to know where all his boys were. He wanted to show those Yogoris what a real car looked like. Kaya was the only son still in the camp, and he had gone off to help someone else load furniture, so Papa announced that he would give all his women a ride. Mama protested, said he ought to get those tires fixed if we expected to take this car all the way into Los Angeles. Papa roared back at her, louder than the engine, and with such a terrible samurai scowl that we all went leaping and piling into the car. Mama laughed, slamming the back door and climbing into the front seat next to him. "You think it's a pretty good car?" he said, pleased by this show of power. Mama said nothing. She sat very stiff, cool, enduring him. Shizu was the placater now, so that means she was like the mediator, leaning forward from the back to pat him on the shoulder. "It's a fine car, Papa. You watch." He grabbed the gear lever and rammed it into low. The Nash leaped, and we were cloppeting down the street on those 2 flats and 2 good tires, with Papa laughing, sipping from the bottle. At the first corner, he said, "You think I can't pick out cars?" Softly, Shizu said, "You did real good, Papa." He stepped on the gas, hitting maybe 30, swerving crazily. In the back seat, we were all thrown around, flung from door to door like rag dolls, with Mama bouncing in front of us and Papa's hat crunching up against the ceiling. May cried out, "Not so fast, Papa, you're going to wreck your car." Think the car can't take it?" he yelled back at her. "You watch this." His gaiety turned ferocious again. So like his excitedness and happiness turned ferocious and mean again. He stomped the pedal, pushing the speedometer up to 35. His right front tire had shredded, and it flopped like a mangled arm. It lashed out, upending a garbage can. I started to cry. Shizu, her calm shattered, was yelling at him to slow down. Mama was too, and May was screaming. He wouldn't listen and told us to hold on while he swung into the street, careening past emptying barracks where suitcases and duffel bags sat stacked. As we passed people standing by the baggage, Papa swerved from one side to the other, waving. He laughed, growled, made faces. In front of us, a laden family was hiking out toward the main gate. Papa swung wide, honking and waving. "Hey, hey," he shouted. They turned, too amazed to wave back. "Don't miss that bus," he yelled. At the next corner, he spun off into a deserted section of barracks. These already looked like the ones we'd first moved into, sand piling up against foundation blocks, the clotheslines empty, all signs and markers gone. It made no difference to Papa that no one was out there to witness his performance. He aimed for tumbleweeds lying in the roadbed and shouted with triumph each time he squashed one. Shizu and Mama and May had quit trying to control him. I'd stopped crying. We grabbed for handholds, covered our heads, hoping simply to survive until he hit something hard or ran out of gas. We came to a fire break and Papa plunged into it, began to cut a twisty path across its emptiness, shouting, "Hi-ya! Hi-ya!" gouging ragged tracks through the dusty sand. The way this fire break lay, there seemed to be nothing in front of us now but sagebrush and open country, rising in the distance south of camp to the range of round, buff-colored hills rumored to be full of rattlesnakes. The few times I'd wished I could walk in one direction for as long as I wanted, the threat of those rattlesnakes deterred me. And now farther south, beyond that visible barrier, out in the world I scarcely remembered, there loomed the dark, threatening cloud I'd heard grown-ups talk about. The way we seemed to be heading, I should have been frightened into a coma. But for this once, I was not. Watching Papa bounce and weave and shout in front of me, I was almost ready to laugh with him. With the first bubbly sense of liberation his defiant craziness had brought along with it. I believed in him completely just then, believed in the fierceness flashing in his wild eyes. Somehow that would get us past whatever waited inside the fearful dark cloud, get us past the heat and the rattlers and a great deal more. At the fence he had to turn, sending up a white billow of dust. Where the fence met the highway, we cornered again, heading for the bus stop. A crowd waited there, standing idly, sitting around on scattered baggage. They all turned to watch when they heard us coming. Papa tooted the horn and yelled out, "No bus for us! No bus for us!" The young kids were mystified by this and stood open-eyed watching. Some of the older folks smiled, waving as we hit a chuck hole and bounced. Papa swung left and we clattered out onto the wide, empty boulevard that ran the length of the camp back to where our own baggage waited and the final packing. Sorry. Okay, and that is the end of the book. So that last part right there, it's a little bit confusing because it sounds like it's something that's actually happening, but it's more of like a vision. that Jean's having, because she's having vivid memories about her time at Manzanar. It's not really like something she's seeing happening right then, literally in front of her, even though it does kind of sound like that. So I did just want to let you guys know that I'll be giving you some kind of study guide to use at the beginning of next week. And we'll do a couple other things with the book, and then you'll be having some kind of like wrap up final test on the whole novel. So if there's something that you've missed or some kind of question that you have, make sure you email me and let me know over the weekend or Monday at the latest, so that I can help you out with that before we have some kind of test next week on the book. And then we'll be moving on into something a little bit more humorous, a little bit lighter. Yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I hope you guys have a good weekend, and I will see you guys on Monday. Bye.